record. Okay. Yeah, it's recording. Okay. Ready?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rajni. I'm the Executive Director of Yoga Service Council. And today, as part of our Yoga and Resilience series, we'll be chatting it up with Darrell Amani Jones, who is a meditation educator and minister at City-Side Spiritual Community in Chicago. So Darrell, thank you for joining us. It's very exciting.
Pleasure to be here. My joy.
You and I know Darrell for a couple of years now through the meditation community. So it's really nice to be able to interview here and to just tell your story. That's really what we're all about.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with this one. Tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of now, like where most of your efforts are with your professional life, nice things about your family, and then we'll get into kind of the growing up years of you.
Sure. So the bulk of my personal professional life straddles the mindfulness space, and that shows up as teaching in a more secular setting, meditation practices, various mindfulness meditation techniques. As we both have been connected to Chill, a place that I helped launch 3 years ago, as a studio, now virtual. And I've done that in a lot of different settings, though. Prior to that, I was doing endeavors on my own where I realized there was the conversation that meditation had in the spiritual context, which I love and return to, and is definitely a part of my personal practice. And my kind of nerddom science geek side of self also appreciates and appreciated the side of it being a tool that would help with behavioral challenges, with psychological challenges, with emotional intelligence, and realize that not everyone always wanted to have that conversation within the paradigm of spirituality. So I worked with hospitals. My wife is a holistic physician, and so in her center, part of that holistic experience is not just as a chiropractor going in and physically manipulating people, but what else is calling imbalances or subluxations in your life beyond the alignment of the spine. So I was doing a lot of work there in her space. At one point, I had an online ministry called Soul Gym, which were 2 words, and I loved the idea of teaching meditation as an exercise. That you would use just like you go to the gym and do a specific exercise to strengthen or bring flexibility and agility into the body. It's something that we can do as well for the mind, for the emotional self. And just my own personal challenge with it being financially viable, it didn't really come to full fruition, but I still use that terminology and language in some of my ministerial work, because I think people, regardless of their specific spiritual beliefs or not, they get the idea of a soul, something that's transcendent of this physical self, even maybe transcendent of our intellectual mind. And that to embrace it as something that can be exercised, like our body can be physically exercised through practices, does something to support its growth and expansion. So straddling that kind of secular and spiritual side, I love to be as inclusive as possible. It's one of the reasons why I love having a spiritual background. My personal background, I have a master's in consciousness studies, and am certified or licensed as a minister through an organization called the Centers for Spiritual Living. And the training there was not about finding a specific belief other than, can the world be more for you as opposed to against you? I mean, if I could boil it down to that being the fundamental truth. But we looked at Christianity, we looked at Judaism, we looked at Islam, we looked at Hinduism, we looked at Taoism, Buddhism, we looked at psychology, we looked at sociology, we even nerded out and talked to a quantum physicist, and all of these ideas of systems that help us become more conscious or understand that we've created these systems to give some framework to our awareness. And when I was finished with that training, already licensed as a spiritual coach prior to going into that, I knew that meditation was kind of like my jam. Like that was the thing that I loved to do personally and to coach people on. But it was just more solidified after I finished that program that meditation is something, or at least mindfulness is something that happens in all of the belief systems of the world, whether they are religious, if they're more psychologically based, or even scientifically based. There is always a pause before stepping into research. There is always a pause and an intention before going into most rituals that are religious. Even in the space of a therapy session, right? Like you don't just randomly go into a therapy session, you stop and you choose, you pick a date, and then when you get to the therapy session, there's some sort of transition into the safe space. And to me, that's all practices of mindfulness. And to take away any of the connections to dogma or certain belief and just say, hey, here's something that we can do in the boardroom. Here's something we can do in the studio of the yoga studio. Here's something we can do in a gym. Here's something you can do in your living room. And so I toggle back and forth and, speak in communities at Cityside here. Now with COVID, I've spoken to communities in Philadelphia and other places, since I can do it from the comfort of this same seat where I am right now.
Yeah.
And in those situations, it's usually how to support people in becoming less passive in their spirituality and more active. And to me, again, a way, even though it is about stilling and pausing, it's still very active to engage in meditation, that there's a responsibility that we can take into that practice. It's not just sitting and waiting for the divine God or spirit to affect something, that we are in partnership. And this is a way that we can be in powerful partnership.
Got it.
So that's kind of the current landscape for me. Whether it's, teaching a meditation class more formally, or if it's a Sunday morning or an evening, service of some sort, helping people find some footing in their spirituality through many practices, but the main one for me is always an element of mindful meditation.
So it sounds like, and there's always this conversation that we have had that, that has been in this whole arena of meditation, mindfulness, and yoga, where it's like, there's a batch of people that are about like cultural appropriation and having it stick rigid to like where it came from. And then there's another side of folks that are like, no, we're just going to take what works for us and just do that. And it sounds like you honor and you embrace all of that, because it sounds like your perspective and your view is, how can these modalities be helpful, no matter who you are?
Absolutely. I attribute, this isn't the sole reason, but just this summer I'll turn 47. So I'm a kid that was born in the early 70s. I consider myself a hip hop head, so in terms of appropriation, whether you use that word negatively or positively just for what the act is, the very essence of hip hop music is about taking all the different sounds and making something new out of it. And so I'm a musician as well. That's why I use that as a reference. I feel that there's a way that isn't necessarily disrespectful to tradition, a way of kindly and truthfully appropriating, or at least lifting up out of these traditions and practices, the fundamental core of them, and finding a way to applying them to a more contemporary context. Because then to me, that just allows access. Some people will not. It was what really pushed me into secular work, if you will, outside of my spiritual, is that I would talk to people and tell them what I do. And I would share about workshops that I would teach. They're like, oh, that's amazing. I'm like, oh, you should come hear me talk on Sunday morning. It's at 10 o'clock. And as soon as I said that, they were like, wait, what? 10 o'clock? Is it a church? And I'm like, well, it's not like your traditional church. So wait, but it is a spiritual community. Yes. And so there was like this immediate wall that would kind of like come down. And so I was like, how can we still bring forward some of these things without, I can't control the baggage that people bring to the conversation, but maybe I can do something to help them unload it and still step into the room. So that's sometimes I've talked to some people where they get very upset. They feel like, oh, this is a specific Buddhist tradition and this is the way it's supposed to be, and you're just watering it down. And it's like, okay, okay. That is a way of looking at it.
That's a perspective. And I think the one thing that, and I've known you for a while, so and your meditation is just so powerful. Like, it makes me want to fall asleep. Like, it's really, really good. Your voice is really good. So what I kind of know from you personally is there's an honoring component that happens with this stuff, and then you take it in and allow it for other folks to be able to relate to it in other ways. It doesn't necessarily strip stuff away. Right. It's not necessarily about that. It's about access. Cool. All right. Well, thank you.
As much as I can, I try to footnote. Like when you write an article and you grab a piece of text or a quote from someone, you want to give props and attribute it and give a footnote or a reference. And as much as I can in a practice, it's like, if this is something that is lifted specifically out of a tradition or a certain teacher or a lineage, to the best of my ability, I try to give recognition where it's due.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, and I know that I've been in your sessions to know that you do that, your meditation sessions. So that's really great, and I think that that's important to do as well. So let's shift base a little bit to little Darrell Amani Jones, growing up. Let's talk a little bit, or share a little bit about kind of where you grew up, what was the culture like in your house, and then what was the culture like outside of your house, and any events and experiences that were pivotal during your growing up years.
So I'll start first with my name to just talk a little bit about my cultural makeup. So Amani is a Swahili term. A lot of people hear Armani, so it's like the Italian word, but take out the R, Amani, which loosely can be translated as peace. And my father, as an African-American man born in the 40s, growing up in the 50s and 60s, during that movement of reconnecting to African roots that were kind of lost, he wanted to have that connection in my name. So that was part of my naming process. And being born in 1973, not only to an African-American father, but to a white mother of German and Irish descent. That was in New Haven, Connecticut. And that was a community, I think, where my parents had me was a beautiful community. It's where they met. And there was some level of understanding that my father was very involved in grassroots community, mostly based in the Black community. And I know that they both got some slack sometimes, as they dated for almost 7 years before they got married. So there was a lot of intention behind their coming together. But ultimately, right before my 4th birthday, my parents moved to Dayton, Ohio. And Ohio today, and it still is, considered to be fairly conservative. But where I grew up was a very kind of interesting microcosm of diversity and multicultural connection, which was, my father's a minister, and he moved to this church because the neighborhood was middle class, lower middle class. There was lots of GM industry at one point in Dayton. So everyone was fairly solid financially for most of my childhood, at least. It's changed significantly now. But the neighborhood in the 60s, like a lot of neighborhoods in urban centers, there started to be this white flight to the suburbs because there was an influx of Black and brown and other people of color into the neighborhood. And that particular church came down to 2 votes as to whether or not they were going to close their doors or keep them open, because the majority of the community was white. Most of them had moved at least 10 to 15, maybe even 20 miles away. And they're like, why are we driving all the way back into the city? Let's just open up another community. And there was a handful of folks that were committed, and they were like, we want to keep this here. And we actually want to move forward with the intention of it being a multicultural, multiracial community. So they decided, they had a current pastor who was white, and they decided they wanted to have a co-pastorship instead of a senior in terms of hierarchy. They wanted to have a co-pastorship, and to the best of their ability, they wanted it to be a biracial co-pastorship. So they brought my father in to partner with this other gentleman who was white, and the two of them for a number of years really held that space. And my father's kind of community cultural activism self helped go out into the community. So not only was it a Christian community, but I grew up with 3 different synagogues in walking distance from my home. I went to a Jewish preschool, a Catholic kindergarten, then public schools. Then I went to a private school in high school that was not religiously affiliated, but we had everybody under the sun there. And so it was just this really, sweet time for me. And the bias that it created for me is I thought everyone grew up with, Joe Smith, David Sumra, all of, I would go to birthday parties where it was like, in particular right now, I'm thinking of David Sumra, where we had pizza, but it was with Indian spices. So it was like wicked hot. It was crazy. I thought that everyone that was Christian celebrated Passover with a rabbi in their basement, like what? And that was a culture shock for me when I left that community. I had experienced racism. I knew that there was divisiveness. I knew that there was a lot of ignorance stemming from fear in communities. And I still generally thought, oh, this is the way the world is because it's the United States and there's lots of people here. And then when I really left and went to college and started living on my own, I was rudely awakened. So that was kind of, the context that Darrell Amani grew up in. My mother's an RN and a nurse. So both of my parents were caregivers to the community. And as far left as you could probably go, my father was as a Christian minister, which was a blessing for me because he didn't force anything upon me. We would have active dialogues and conversations. My mom, as a feminist, hated calling God he all the time, so she would drop a she bomb into the conversation. And he didn't, make that wrong. It was just part of the dialogue. So that was the framework and the consciousness that I grew up in my household.
Wonderful. And that's what a blessing to have that, to grow up in such a multicultural, exposed environment where you have, 2 parents from 2 different racial backgrounds, and just kind of coming together. And I love how you said, like, they dated for 7 years. So it was very intentional, moving through, especially at that time, to be a couple where one is white and one is black. That's a big deal.
It was huge.
And that's really wonderful because I can see now that I know about this part of your background, I can see, that makes a lot of sense how Darrell is this way, like very collected and just open, accessible to everything and everyone.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So if you were to think, and I know that I'm popping this question on you, so if you were to think that, you mentioned that you did experience racism, you did experience intolerance while even in the community. And I think that's to be expected, because just because you grew up in a multicultural environment or ethnic environment doesn't remove that experience capacity. No. So can you think of a time when, and maybe it wasn't your first time, but a moment where it just really hit you, like, oh shit, this is about the color of my skin?
Yeah. In particular, I think it was like 11 or 12. We were at, there was a friend's birthday, and for his birthday, his mom took us out to the mall, and we went to see a movie and had popcorn and fun. And it was a later movie. I think we got out around 9 o'clock. And the buses that ran out to the mall, which the more and more I tell the story and think about it, I'm like, oh, why did they stop running the buses out? Thinking of the community that were accessing the buses and going there. The buses stopped running. So we couldn't take a public bus back into the neighborhood. And my friend, it was a single parent home, and his older brother had a broken leg and was with his friend, so she couldn't come pick us up, but we thought we would just take the bus. And there was about 10 of us, I think. And we realized we couldn't take the bus, but it was running maybe a mile away. So we just said, oh, we'll just walk. We're having a good time. We've just seen some movie. Probably it was somewhat violent. So we were probably pushing each other around, being silly boys. And we get to this one turn in the road and look across the street, and there's a gas station and some guys are getting gas. And it was a Friday or Saturday night. So I'm assuming they were definitely older. We were only 12. They were obviously old enough to drive. I'm assuming they were drinking. But regardless, there was a yell across the street. There were some N words dropped, and they literally hopped in their cars and just started driving at us.
Wow.
And we had just gone from kind of like a sidewalk space into an open parking lot. And their foot was on the gas and not coming off. I mean, it was definitely, they were trying to scare or whatever, but we were running, and the slower kid in the group literally ran out of his shoes. It was the 80s when you wore fat laces and nothing was tied. So like they slipped off his feet. But the thing that saved him was like one of those parking, the concrete dividers. He jumped over that. We ran in between two buildings, and it was an all-night donut shop. And we called my dad, and he came and picked us up. But it was such an overt, expression of hatred. I mean, we were children, and these were grown men. So that's probably the most like really overt. Nothing physically happened to us, but I considered it a violent act at us. Another way that I experienced it was there was a large Vietnamese community after the war that found its way into Dayton. And so there were a lot of Vietnamese kids in the public high school that I went to for a year. And I played soccer, and soccer was a big sport that these kids played. And we would play some of the country or like more outskirt schools, and all kinds of derogatory gooks and things like that, and just blatant physical violence against those players, which the referees never corrected. Was really powerful to see. And also weird, as a person of color, this is high school, so I'd had that racial experience. I'd had other, times in my life where I felt like I was been singled out because of my race. To witness someone else experience the same thing and me not be a part of it in terms of the group that was being hated on, I guess, was just kind of weird and mind-blowing. Obviously, I identified with them, and we had a conversation, talked about it, and the team rallied around them. But it was weird to not be on the receiving end. So those are probably from my childhood, some bigger moments.
And, I think as you are so ingrained, and it is part of your life and your foundation, spiritual practice, meditation, everything, especially when you're a kid and you have that experience of someone driving at you, calling you names. I mean, that stuff settles into your bones. It settles into the fiber of your being. And, I always, my thing that personally, what I think about and examine more and more is growing up as in the Black community, Indigenous, people of color, etc. You learn resiliency, or you're forced to learn resiliency at a very, very early age.
Yes.
When you're living in a country that is not of your, quote unquote origin. Like, I'm not living in India. I was raised in Brooklyn for half my life. And so there are these things that you contend with that I think helps build that strength over time, even when the experiences are just so like, oh shit, it's like those kind of moments. So as you reflect on all of those things, given your environment and these level of experiences, how do you feel they informed your own strengthening, like your inner will and obviously your compassion?
Right. Well, I would have to say that coming home to a mixed race family definitely impacted how I received those attacks or experiences. It could be very easy, I think, and probably is the norm, that when something like that happens in a home of color, that there is a wall that goes up to protect, right? And rightfully so. And in my home, with that kind of Christian Jesus looking of, turn the other cheek, on top of coming home to seeing a white face in my mother, um, there was an immediate jarring of that defensiveness into a space of, well, one, are you okay? How do you feel? And we didn't do any heavy processing around it as a kid, but I do know that there was definitely some way that it was held that wasn't just about someone's right and someone's wrong, and that there was a conversation about misunderstanding and fear and and some level of the historical context of just race in this country, right? So with that, it gave me some pause. And not that it makes a difference, but the other side of that story, they probably would have hated them as well. If I'm going to stereotype the the racists that were there were two other Jewish boys with us. So you don't necessarily know someone's religious background by looking at them, but obviously their skin was not dark, and that didn't matter. It was like, well, they're just lumped into this. So there was just this. It was definitely a conversation about just fear, anger, and ignorance and misunderstanding. And I think that's fueled how I have moved forward. I don't consider myself a Christian, but in terms of Christian qualities that are celebrated, that idea of compassion and forgiveness, that was so palpable in my home. That definitely is something that has allowed me, in terms of a resiliency, to be in a space of leaning in as opposed to leaning away. And when I lean in, I'm not putting my hands up. I'm stretching my hand out, saying, let's come and talk. Let's do something. Let's find a way to be with this. Whether we come to an understanding or an agreement or not, I want to lean in and have dialogue with you, relationship with you, period. That has definitely influenced me. And that's definitely influenced even today in the midst of everything. Whenever I talk to someone who's having a hard time, including myself, when I kind of take myself off the ledge, the question is, well, what is mine to do? What is my purpose in life? And my purpose in life is to love and be loved. And if I'm not willing to love someone who even says they hate me and somehow express love towards them, it's not about giving them a hug and $50 for their birthday or whatever it may be, but in terms of a spiritual practice or a mindfulness practice of being present with what is, that definitely started very young in my childhood, more in the religious spiritual context, but it has continued to be a foundation that I've built upon into my adult life as it comes to race relations, for sure.
Yeah, and I think you brought up something very powerful and very important in relation to, there is discrimination when it comes to the color of your skin. And there's discrimination that other religions have that we have seen since the beginning of time, I feel, honestly. And just how there's been those delineations with people of color since I feel like the beginning of time. But I love what you said was so amazing and such a pivot from what you typically hear, which is, I'm going to lean in, not with my fists up, but taking my hand forward. And I think that's a really powerful statement because, it gives you another way to approach a conversation in which love is not the language. So I like that very much. Thank you.
Well, I don't go through this thought process. It's muscle memory for me now, but we were talking about the power of story, and I can't remember the specific country. I want to say this is like a Yoruba tribe story. But when children in this particular African community would step outside of the community and do something wrong or hurt someone in the community, the action was not one of shaming. It was not one of punishment. It was bringing that child to the center of the community, being surrounded by the elders and others, and saying, "What do you need? How can we help you? How have we let you down that you're taking this step or this action?" And that to me is what I try to hold in mind, especially today, because the one thing that I get personally frustrated with is that even in the marginalized and ostracized communities, I feel like, yes, we have to care for ourselves, we have to protect ourselves, but if we're going to call ourselves a community, it's not about separation. That's all that everyone goes to. And if we're going to live in this country or in this state or in this city, where there are always going to be people that have different opinions about anything, but there's always going to be people that are misinformed and uninformed or not informed at all about culture and race of others that don't look like them, then to just put up a hand and say, "You can't be near me," or "I won't talk to you," is not doing anything to build the community. So I feel like, as a resilient member of the COP community, I feel like it's my duty to be one of those, to go out to the edge and say, "All right, let's talk. I'm willing to listen to you." It's not an easy thing to do. It's not comfortable at all. But that's what, in terms of what you heard me say, that's what, sticking a hand out as opposed to putting up a dude.
And so this kind of relays a little bit, and then I want to go into the conversation about when you went to college and you had some experiences of understanding how people weren't brought up in a multi-ethnic community as much as you may have. There is this conversation about the talking is good, and everybody has a role. When events like Black Lives Matter movement happens and at the stage that it is. And so there's always different sectors and different places and spaces, right, that look at things differently. So there's one group that might be, it's all about action, prove yourself to me because I'm so sick and tired of the same, chatter and nothing changes. And then there's another group that is about the conversation and let me be a helper in the community in the way that I can be and I understand to be. Then there's folks that are in the middle. Kind of both. One is, they're like helpers and they want to go and have those conversations, and they're involved in the action of things, in whether that's being part of the community that pushes legislation forward, policy changes, supporting in various ways of changing how funding may possibly be working and going into different communities. I think the biggest thing that we're talking about right now, or by the time your video airs, but the hope is that the conversation keeps going about, changing how funds are allocated to go to, police departments, and looking at re-examining the process in that institution. So as you said, we develop a community, and how we develop a community matters. What to you is pertinent in terms of action as it follows the conversation, as it leads to shifts and changes that are a lot deeper than perhaps before?
Yeah. In terms of action, so just to clarify, when you say action, are you talking about more
so I'll explain.
Action around the system, because you were talking about defunding, or are you talking about community action?
I would say both.
Okay.
I would say from a systems perspective, not everybody wants to be in that change process. Some people want to be in the change process with the community. So picking and choosing also is part of the process. But overall, what is your perspective, your opinion, and your own experience within that?
Right. Well, I draw a lot of my information on this from the life of my father, and watching how he navigated things. That the conversation, a little bit higher, whether you want to call it the political conversation, the governmental conversation, the systematic or systemic conversation, it's important to be engaged in that. Mm-hmm. And to be a voice, not of dissent for the sake of being dissent, but to be a voice of the community, and of maybe the community that doesn't have as strong a voice as others, whether that voice is because of literally it's not being listened to, or financially their dollars don't speak as loud. Mm-hmm. So I do think in terms of action, it's important to have conversation and dialogue. Almost every single talk or interview that I've done like this, I don't think he cares at all about me, but in terms of engaging that level of system, like leadership to me is so important, and how our leaders in the country show up. And I've just been appalled, by the way that President Trump has not addressed things quickly, and not even shown up in terms of going specifically to George Floyd. Like, whether he had an opinion about the thing, it was a shit show in this area of the country. And to not go there as the leader and somehow be a presence, that just blew my mind. So whether it's on that high level, or even at the state or the city or the local government level, I think it's important to engage in conversations of leadership and be a place of not showing up again in that fight place, because it just shuts people down, but maybe to be in a conversation and dialogue of impact. I'm looking to you as a leader, and this is how your choices and decisions, or lack thereof, is impacting my community. This is how your words are supporting me, or this is how your words are hurting me. And depending upon what is happening, to not only go in and point out the fault, but to me, I think about it on the business side. Every time I've worked for someone, they want someone to come in and, sure, you want to be told this isn't working or this is working. But if you just go in and say, this sucks, what does that do? If you can come in and say, this sucks or this isn't great, and here's the idea that I have. So to be proactive in engaging the more governmental, systemic, system-based conversation. But then that same principle to me goes into the community side. And that's what my father did really well. He would engage local representatives, he would engage local neighborhood councils, and then he would go into the community and have some of the same conversations of, we are a community, so how are we going to stay connected during this? And what do you need to stay connected as a leader, albeit not governmental, but as a spiritual leader in the community? What is it that I can support you with? Or this is what I'm bringing to you. Is this enough? Tell me if you need something else. So I see, to me, it's all about dialogue and conversation. If we don't stay connected in some way, especially in the hardest moments of challenges like this, then decisions can be made, laws can be enacted, policies can be funded or defunded, but it doesn't really get underneath things. This is kind of like, I don't know where I sit in the whole defunding of police systems, but what I do know is that that's not going to solve anything.
Right.
And when it comes to race understanding in our country, which is what undergirds this challenge, it's not just about police. It's a race conversation. It's a community conversation. And if we don't go there, then okay, that is something that would take away an element of power that could be abused, but power is still going to be influenced.
That's true.
And it may be sideways, more so. So I don't know if I answered the question or not.
You did. And like I said, the thing with with why it's about storytelling and experiencing people through their lives and events is to understand how, through all of this, there is a resiliency that is being developed in this current environment. There's something about it that is creating more strength. And the other flip side of it seeing the compassion that comes from it, and then understanding where you come from, your story helps to understand like what techniques and, we'll talk about this later, toolkits, that developed, that were changed, and later on we'll get to what happens when nothing in your toolkit worked. So it makes sense as we relate to the community, larger and small. So I want to shift, with just a little bit more time in our interview, I just want to shift over to, you were talking about in college, that conversation of when you realize like, oh shit, not everybody grew up the way I grew up.
Right.
What happened with that?
So, I mean, just quickly, for me, college, I went to a small liberal arts college. There were maybe 1,300 students on campus, max. And so that brought a lot of diversity from the standpoint of that, it was a school that wanted to have it's a liberal arts school, so they want to have a spectrum of students there. So there were kids from the country, kids from the city, kids from the Midwest, kids from the East Coast, the West Coast. We had a pretty large exchange program with other countries. We had a French house, we had an African house, we had a Spanish house, we had a German house. But there were, folks that would grow up in pockets of the country where it was so small and insulated. And it's interesting, that idea of racism, and this is probably a whole other interview and conversation, but I believe that we are all racists, period.
Yeah.
Regardless of your skin color.
Yeah.
Because we just have notions about race. Right. And if it's making discerned or preconceived notions about someone, then I believe that we truly all are. The challenge is when people have those learned racist ideology that's indoctrinated as this is the way it is, that people of color, people of African descent, people of native origin in a country, whatever it may be, are less than, regardless if you know them or not. And if you do know them, there's an element of their very biological DNA that is less than yours because you are of this. I mean, that's a very specific indoctrinated thing. But I believe that we all have these preconceived notions and biases until we have something to confront it that challenges that thought. And so most of what I faced in college was not aggressive. It was just sheer ignorance. Kids that did not have any exposure to any other culture or skin color or face other than what was insulated in their community. So, it would just be, I'm trying to think of some specific comments. It was more or less staring sometimes, like, and at that time I have no hair now, but I was growing out dreadlocks, I was having my own kind of like cultural exploration. So, kids kind of looking at me, what's going on? Some assumptions, if you think of like, okay, I grew up in rural America and I watched the news, and my one understanding, or one of my main understandings of how Black people show up in the country, especially men, is that they play basketball because they're on all these big teams. I like playing basketball, but it's not like my thing. I played it in high school, and I think I may have played on like an intramural just for exercise. And, there were a couple of comments are like, oh, can't you dunk? And I'm like, nope, can't do it. Can't palm a ball, sorry. So kind of just like some insensitive things that were said to me, or about music and dancing, and like, Black people can dance, Black people can sing. And some of those kind of stereotype things that to me are not meant to be inflicting a wound when they're said, they're just ignorant. So that's mostly how it showed up. The interesting thing that I found, though, at least this was the early 90s in college, and this, if you historically look, I think, back into the 60s and 50s, there's such a close mirroring, at least philosophically, between the women's movement and race relations and race equality in this country. So there was a Black student organization that I was involved with that would celebrate Black culture. There weren't tons of classes, though. I think the only Black professors were in the theater department, maybe. Well, there was one, I think, in philosophy. But I found myself being very intrigued by a lot of like feminist like classes. So I took one called Women in the Modern Western State. It was a poli-sci class, and it was like dense. Like it was so, in terms of it being an intellectual study. But the gift that that gave me was all of the ways that the women, in terms of stories, women sharing their stories of how they were ostracized, marginalized, or just hurt by the system of everything being male-centric, really like popped my eyes open. And I'm like, okay, wait, let me just forget about my skin color for a minute. I'm one of these men, right? And there's conscious ways that I get engaged in, you know, issues of gender that are supportive or unsupportive to women. And then there's unconscious ways. And again, in terms of how that allows me to stick a hand out to those people that I would really probably, like at my gut level, want to punch in the face, is if I can pause for a moment and go, wait a minute, how can I connect to them? I just think of myself as a man, and some of the unconscious ways that I may still, even to this day, say something, allude to something, make reference to something that is just sheer ignorance on my part of how that may be impacting the woman standing next to me, or impacting the lives of women in general. And that allows me then to connect to people that are not of color or are in the, you know, the more Western, Anglo, Euro background, go, oh, can I understand their ignorance here a little bit, as I reference that in relationship to being a man in a man's world, that some would say, right? So that was probably the one of the big ways that it informed me. And then seeing overt, I remember we had a women's conference one weekend, and some guys put up a poster in one of the dorms, "Dear Feminazi, take your dykey unshaved legs," you know, like, and they were trying to be funny and cute, but it was pretty violent, aggressive language. And the beauty again of a liberal arts college is we stopped classes. It paused for a day and we had conversations. So again, that was something that was modeled to me of like, oh, we didn't just like find someone and run them up the flagpole. We actually said, let's get in the room here and talk about this.
Wow.
What's going on? And it was heavy, but it was important. And that was a kind of a pivotal going, oh, okay. We can have a conversation about this. It's not about punishment only. You know, there needed to be some corrective actions, but there needed to be a conversation, because it wasn't just about one person doing something right or wrong. That was a symptom of a larger challenge in the community. So let's get everyone talking about this.
Yeah. And like I said, you know, or like you said, this, if we go back to the value structures or looking at the process of conversation, even when it's like in your gut and you're like, I just don't want to engage, but you do it anyway, because there's a broader capacity that you're tapping into. And I really resonated with that. And I think a lot of us, everybody listening will probably resonate with this, is that everybody's racist. You know, you've got that level of implicit bias, some type of discrimination within your own culture, right? So that happens, let alone outside, you know, that happens. And I think that right now the focus is on Black Lives Matter, and the focus is there, which is great and it's important. And I think that as this is just like you mentioned, that, you know, the feminist movement, you can see it replicate, you can see the mirror of it in the people of color and the Black Lives Movement.
Right.
I think going forward, especially this whole thing that we've got going on with Black Lives Movement, and the depth of it is also going to be a mirror for something else. And then that's going to be for something else, because I think there's so much to be excavated simply because we're human, and simply because of the history of how we, how the development of the US. Yeah.
Well, the thing, if I can just quickly speak to it, you know, I've only seen a couple of articles. I try to not kind of bombard myself with media, because a lot of it to me just doesn't always come from a great place. It's just trying to keep the spin going. Yeah. And it's easy for me to get caught up into it. So I just step away, not in a place of apathy, but just like, this is not what's going to inform how I relate to it. But I've taken note of the protests that are happening outside of the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, in Europe. And I was talking to another person, actually of mixed racial and ethnic background, and they were kind of mad. They were like, in terms of that word of appropriation, they're like, why are the Europeans like appropriating this American, you know, United States based thing? And I was like, okay, but so the Black lives of someone in another country are somehow different than the importance of Black lives in the United States. They're like, well, that's not what I'm saying, but this is a problem here, and it's a police. And I said, okay, but here's the thing: you got to recognize, and it was one of our youth. So I think he's 19. So it was really, really powerful to have a conversation with another generation younger than us in terms of how they were seeing things. And I said, I had the privilege to study in Strasbourg, France for almost 6 months, my junior year in college. I was there with 13 other of my white student counterparts. We had a little center where we would meet and do language strengthening, and then we took classes in the university. And we would travel a lot, and we had train passes. And whenever you would pass borders, and this was in '93, so it was different than it is now. There was always, you know, you check your passport, your papers, and visas. Why are you here? But a lot of the time we would pass a border, and if I was traveling with my counterparts, we'd be sitting in a car by ourselves. It'd be 5 of us. And we'd all hold up our American passports, which were a little bit, I mean, just to, you know, understand privilege, just by that thing being there was privilege. But what would happen is that the Border Patrol would look at all of the passports, see that they were American, look at me dead in the eye, and I was the only one that he would look at the paper, at the stamp, and make sure that it was valid. And then he'd say, oh, okay, I know the rest of you are good. And so just to speak to the trigger of what's happening in the United States, also activating the same level of anger and frustration for people of color in countries outside of our borders. To me, I experienced it in another country, you know, so I get it. And it makes complete and total sense to me, that we don't have to like fight for our racism is more real in this country than it is somewhere else. I was like, wait a minute.
My racism is more powerful than yours.
Yeah, like let's not get righteous about being hated more, or like, you know, our whatever. So just to speak that the Black Lives Movement is an organic thing. It's like not run by a person. There may be people organizing, but I think it is the consciousness that is moving about not only our country, but about the world. And the concern that I have right now, and I'll step back from the conversation after this, is the conversation that I'm having with some folks of all race is like, what does hashtag Black Lives Matter mean to you? And why do you believe Black Lives Matter? Is it simply a slogan that gets slapped onto a post that you tape up to your window or you put on your car door? What is it really about to you? And the reason I'm asking that question is that I see a slight turn, and it's where the extreme right always goes to. But I feel that right mentality finding its way towards the middle is that, oh, well, if Black Lives Matter, then why not all lives matter? Or to the contrast, Blue Lives Matter. And it's like understanding why that particular phrase has import and impact and the system that it's talking about. Not saying that Black lives are more important than anyone else's, or that people of color are more important. So it's an interesting point in the progression of where we are with protests and conversations about the community to me.
So it's the examination that the movement of Black Lives Matter is a specific focus on systemic issues that have to change, And I think that makes sense. I mean, I think we've seen that a lot of this. I don't even know what the right word is, where, people are like, well, all lives matter. It's like, yeah, no one's saying that all lives don't matter, but right now the focus needs to be this, because, I always say, kind of, there's everybody and every community, every organization, every movement, whatever, comes to a point where enough is enough.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move. Some changes need to happen. So awesome. And then the last piece that I want to kind of get into, Darrell, is, the toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like I have a good idea of what your toolkit is. But there's two pieces to this. So one, the toolkit that has showed up for you, or the piece of your toolkit that has showed up for you the most, maybe one or two things that is the most important ones that you have held as your deepest companions in this moment. And then, has there been a time when nothing has worked, and then what have you done then?
Mm-hmm. So the most powerful tool in my toolkit is meditation. Whether you want to call it mindfulness based or mindful meditation, the act of pausing and becoming still, I think, can't happen enough in a society where it's constantly about getting up and going and doing and changing and manipulating and fixing. That the ignorant words that are spoken and the ignorant choices that are made that are uninformed come from a space of reactivity as opposed to conscious response, myself included. If I reflect on my life at any point in time when I've kind of made a bad decision or I said something that I didn't really mean, it was a reaction and it popped out of my mouth, or the decision yes or no happened and I didn't really consider the implications of what was happening. And so to continue to be in that practice of pausing trains myself to even have a split-second pause before reacting sometimes, so I can consciously choose to respond. Whether it's a big, strong emotion of anger or even a big, strong emotion of joy and love. Sometimes people don't make great decisions when they're in that kind of elated, blissful space, and they do some really crazy things. So that's probably the biggest thing for me. And when I bring that into my spiritual practice, in terms of having a conversation or a dialogue with the idea of the universe or God or spirit or mother, father, presence, Gaia, whatever the term may be, I really like to approach it as a conversation and a dialogue. And so prayer is a big part of my life, but I see prayer as a way of talking to or at whatever this presence may be. It's where we ask for things, or we declare things, or we affirm things. But then the space of meditation is where we listen and we can receive messages back. We can get guidance and direction. And if we don't have, I think of the Taoist symbol of the yin and the yang, like if we don't have that complete, then it's not a full circle. It's just one side of the coin. So those are the two big components of my personal toolkit. And then if I have, which it happens regularly because I'm human, I always say that we're spiritual beings having a human experience and we're dancing in between the two. Right now, this is a very sexy time to be human and get caught up in all the craziness of being human. And so there's been days where I sit in meditation and it just propagates more anger. Or I try to pray something that's a little bit more affirmative, or turn my attention to something that's more positive. And all I can do is sit in a space of like helplessness or sorrow. And that is when I reach out to someone. So it's the practice of connecting to someone else, whether it be my wife, whether it be one of my ministerial colleagues or one of my meditation colleagues, even my mom. Talking to someone and basically saying, I can't know something great right now. Can you help me? Yeah. All I want to do is either punch the wall, punch a person, or eat a whole thing of pizza, potato chips, and a fifth of bourbon and die, and just pass out on the floor. Yeah. And so those have passed in just the past few weeks. I've had those moments and days, and being able to have a friend of mine always called it his A team. So like someone that surrounds you, that regardless of time of day, that when you call and reach out, text, call in some way, there's going to be someone that picks up the phone or replies to you to just buoy you and keep your head above water. So that's kind of like my final straw, I guess, that I would pull out, or trick.
That's powerful, because sometimes I think when we look at, the resiliency toolkit and the process of building, we want community, talking about it to someone, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a minister, whoever it is. I think sometimes we forget that when all else fails, reach out. That's important. That's your heart getting some space.
And that whole idea of resiliency, it's about recovering, right? It's about returning to some semblance of whether you want to call it equanimity, balance. Not that you need to stay there all the time, that we're trying to get to some destination, but what can we do? I love water, so that's an image for me. It's like, if I swim really strong, which I do, but if I get really fatigued and tired, it's hard to hold myself up above water. What can I do to just give myself a little bit of buoyancy? Just grab a piece of wood. Just take it, even hold a breath for a minute and bring myself up. It's like, what can I do to lift myself up for a second? Who can I tap on to help me recover a little bit more quickly? Not to a place of like perfection, but just get out of this space that's obviously not serving me, and one that I'm having a hard time being in.
Yeah. Got it. Well, Darrell, as usual, love the shit out of you. You're an amazing person.
Love you too.
Thank you so much. And you are, we're both at Chill Anywhere. So people can find you there, as well as Cityside Spiritual Community, where you're a minister in Chicago. And then, just tapping and tuning into that website, they'll be able to see if there's any other virtual platforms that they can tap into and connect with you. Yeah, this has been great. I love this. Thank you, Darrell. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. It was an honor.
Yeah, we'll chat in a bit.
Okay. Ciao.